Hello and welcome to everyone joining us for Take the Controls, How CIOs Can Become Digital Transformation Pilots. It's been said that one consequence of the pandemic is that digital transformation strategies, once expected to last a decade, were executed in a matter of weeks. CIOs were suddenly thrust into the spotlight as they and their teams race to survive and thrive in this new era. But for some technology leaders, their roles have not evolved to keep up. Once focused on running IT and technology operations, many of them can be described as co-pilots or even engineers, stewards who are advising the C-suite or simply keeping the business running. But to harness the full potential of these new digital technologies, CIOs must take the proverbial controls, reimagine enterprises, and chart the course forward through business transformation. And in this session, we're going to talk to three CIOs and basically sort of talk to them about how they see their roles have evolved during the pandemic and how they're guiding their enterprises forward. So my name is Greg Lindsay, I'm with Fast Coworks, and I'm delighted to introduce you to our group of panelists. First, we have Sanjay Srivastava, Chief Digital Officer of Genpact, Phil Mkcoy, CIO of Optum, and George Llado, who is Senior Vice President and Head of IT for Alexion, part of AstraZeneca Rare Disease. This session is in partnership with our friends at Genpact, and will feature a whole timely discussion here about really how the role of the CIO and other leaders have evolved in the last year and a half and how they will change in the future. So on that note, I'd like to start with Sanjay. If you could talk in your own words, obviously since you work with so many CIOs across so many industries, how has that role transformed in the last 18 months? What does it mean to be the pilot of an organization from a CIO perspective?
Greg, thank you for having me here, and great to be part of this panel. Listen, I think the pandemic has changed many things. It feels like we're on a musical chairs game now. Everyone's sort of getting up, moving one to the right, and the music is going to stop sometime, and you have to figure out where to sit. And that's the nature of transformation that's happening in the industry. There's massive disruption that is happening behind it. And digital leaders, and it's very clear if you look at the data, are actually seeing a much faster recovery since March of 2020 than digital laggards. And that data is coming through very clearly. And so because of that, transformation has become key to corporate agendas, and a lot of that is now falling upon the CIOs to be able to execute and get it done. And therefore, the role of the CIO itself is changing. We'll double click into that in a minute.
Great. Well, I say George and Phil obviously would love, as two leaders in the trenches on this and full-fledged pilots in your own right. How have your roles changed in the last 18 months? Like, what is it? How do you interact now with other leaders? Because this is what I think is really interesting. Is CIOs again were sort of supportive functions, and now I would imagine that things have changed rapidly, and now that you're driving directions forward. So I don't know, George, if you could take the lead first on this. Like, how has your role changed during the pandemic and on the far side of it?
Yeah, Greg. First of all, thanks for having me. Appreciate it, and thanks for your time. So life will never be the same, right? I mean, I think it's totally changed, never to go back. And I totally agree with Sanjay in terms of the digital leaders that have just popped up in the last 18 to 20 months. And I think we've been thrust into the spotlight that we've been asking for the last 4 or 5 years, right? And throughout our careers. And you talk about the relationships and interrelationships. And prior to pandemic, there was pushing rocks uphill, right? Or pushing rope, right? Uphill, dealing with our peers in terms of the digital agenda and transformation of the enterprise. What it's now turned to is a direct conversation with the CEO on how does the company drive revenue? How do we look at patients differently? How do we change the experience for our patients? And the world has totally changed, and we're the pilots. I forget co-pilot. We're pilots.
Can you give an example of that? I mean, what sort of initiatives did you launch, again, the sort of changed environment that we're in now post-pandemic in terms of like how you raced to do this? I mean, I'm curious if you can get an example about a particular project, initiative, service that really underscores how that role has changed.
Absolutely. 2018, Greg, engagements with doctors for pharmaceutical companies was totally relegated to physical touch. The relationship. I visit your office. I talk to you about data points for my product relative to my disease. The pandemic totally changed the game where doctors' offices were locked. We couldn't go out. And the virtual game we had to step up our virtual digital game. And so this HCP and doctor virtualization in terms of how do I get more time to educate you about my product so patients can get healthier. We got more minutes during the pandemic than when we were physically speaking to a doctor, which is just fantastic.
Great. Well, Phil, how did it change for you? I mean, obviously you and George are in somewhat similar industries here, but I mean, CIO of the IT arm of a Fortune 5 company there. I mean, how did you see your role transformed, and how did your team scramble?
Yeah, well, thanks, Greg. And Greg, thanks for having me here today. And George and Sanjay, it's an honor to be here with you. It's interesting. I feel like the world changed in a matter of weeks. And, George on one end of the healthcare spectrum, myself on the other, it really was fascinating the pace at which things changed. And to that same point around, doctors' offices shutting down. But the other piece I would say, in addition to how you thought about care delivery and how you thought about care coordination, you were forced and pushed into a virtual environment so much faster than you ever had been before. I mean, I think we went from thousands of visits to millions of visits. The transformation happened so quickly. The other piece I would add in terms of the pace of the transformation as well was, George, I love what you said. Sometimes it's be careful what you ask for, right? Because, technology that might have operated in the background was now at the forefront. And I'll never forget that first 2 or 3 weeks of just getting people, productive from their homes, getting our call center agents productive from their homes was an amazing, daunting task. But it made it very real for everyone in the organization how you were how you were being supported, the team that was supporting you, and the effort that was needed in order to make sure you were productive from your house in a matter of weeks. So we got thrust into right into the front row in terms of how we enabled this organization to operate. And I think it's incredibly exciting and bodes incredibly well for the future.
Greg, I might want to add to that because we actually were very intentional about this. So we went out and worked with MIT and the Sloan School. We actually did a global survey of CIOs. I think we reached about 500 CIOs and did a very statistically valid sort of understanding of it. And what came out, and you used the word pilot before. So think about an aircraft, right? There's a pilot that's actually flying the plane. There's a co-pilot that works with the pilot and other stakeholders to make sure the plane's being flown. And then there's flight engineers. They're the people that without whom a flight would not take off the ground. They drive a really important function for that aircraft, but they're not the pilots. We've tracked this over time. And this year, when we actually went down and looked at the survey, what we found is about 83% of CIOs that we spoke with self-define, self-classify their own roles as either pilots or co-pilots. They're either leading the digital transformation in the enterprise, they're working with stakeholders to actually drive that and make that happen. Only about 17% classified themselves as flight engineers. By the way, there's no shame in that. That's a really important function without which the business wouldn't operate. But that's the world we came from. 5 years ago, 7 years ago, those numbers were inverted. And that's the big change we're seeing come through in the back of the digital transformation we're seeing right now.
Interesting. Well, Sanjay, building off that, what are the hallmarks of a successful pilot? How, you quantified it there too, but how would you describe that? What are the traits? What are the types of organizations? How do they make that transition from co-pilot to pilot?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things we're learning through the journey is the notion of being an insider and an outsider, and yet doing both of those things simultaneously at the same time. Here's what I mean by that. Look, the reality is to be a digital transformation agent, you have to be thoughtful about emerging technologies, the new tech that's coming around, understand the startup ecosystem, work closely with VCs. You need to be not boxed in by the four walls of the enterprise. You need to be able to put yourself outside of that and be able to drive that thinking inside. And so you have to be an outsider, otherwise you won't be successful. Well, here's the flip side of the equation. Transformation we're driving right now is fundamental. It's grounds up. It's complete. It's comprehensive. And so it must be embraced and adopted and used much more pervasively. And it fundamentally changes the way work gets done, which means you need people on board, you need champions, you need stakeholders, you need the entire organization behind you. And therefore, to have the credibility, to have the track record, to get the people behind you, you need to be an insider. And that's one of the biggest paradoxes we face as CIOs. And Phil and George share the same emotion that I have, which is you have to simultaneously be an outside in person and yet be an inside out person. And bringing those two skills together is the name of the game now.
No, absolutely. Go ahead, George.
I would to Phil and Sanjay's point, CIOs, I characterize them as pilots when they first get their job, right? Because we're paid very well, and we're sort of the we're batting, we're the designated hitters, and we're supposed to hit the ball out of the park. That's a 12 to 18 month window, Greg. And I believe that there are CIOs, when they execute well, they continue to sit in the pilot seats, and some just get demoted to something else, right? And they're sitting at the children's table if they don't perform in the 12 to 18 months. Now, what's really cool about our jobs and what the pandemic has done is we set the table in 2017, 2018. So my personal experience was people thought that I was putting snow tires on a car in the summer with all of the investment and spending that I was doing. I talked about this virtual doctor platform. And so people thought the investment in 2018 was a snow tire in the summer. Why are you spending this money? It doesn't make any sense. We're not going to need the snow tire. Well, it snows in the winter. And when the pandemic came, that capability really, really helped us from a both bottom line and top line perspective. And that's what kept me in the pilot seat, having the discussions that I'm having now about the future back for the enterprise, not the present forward. And it's a totally different conversation than previously.
Well, totally. Well, Phil, I'm curious your thoughts on this as well. I mean, if winter has come to George's metaphor there, and I want to ask all three of you in a way too about the sprint was one thing, going through the heart of the crisis into whatever world we live in now. But how have things reconfigured? I mean, how have your organizations changed? Where now, once again, for at least for another 12 to 18 months, you are full-fledged pilots and have control of this aircraft. So Phil, I mean, what organizationally, how are things rewired inside of Optum and United Health Group? Now that the sprint is behind you.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I think as CIOs, we have this unique vantage that cuts across our entire organization. And we have this unique vantage point that allows us to see connections and intersections in ways that most business leaders don't have that same vantage. And so one of the things that I've seen change in our organization is the role that CIOs have played in terms of connecting our businesses and understanding the common threads and the common needs. And yes, there is a piece of it that is around the infrastructure and the operations. And we have an amazing team here at United Health Group that layers and supports that stability, that security. But what's been more interesting for me is the way that we've pulled that thread from a payer side of our business into a services side of our business, into a clinical delivery side of our business, and connected those in a way that makes sure that we're delivering on patient needs. Because for us, we're a unique business. We've got a payer side, we've got a RX side, we've got a care delivery side, and throughout the pandemic, all of those pieces needed to be connected in ways that they've never needed to be connected before, in terms of how data flowed, in terms of how work flowed, in terms of how we supported those internal processes. And I think as a CIO here, as CIOs here, we have this unique vantage point. And I think I've seen the business lean into that in ways that perhaps I haven't seen in the past. And I don't think that's ever going to go back. I think, we've always had a seat at the table here at United Health Group, but the reality is, I think we're shaping and driving strategy in ways now that we haven't in the past, because we realize how important it is that all of our businesses are digitally connected to make sure that we're doing the right thing by the people that we serve. It's very different, and I actually think it's incredibly exciting as we look forward.
Interesting. Well, Sanjay, building off that, last time I asked you what are the hallmarks of a pilot. This time, what are the hallmarks of a CIO piloted organization? Building on Phil's point there, what traits and tendencies do these firms have? Are they able to launch digital products faster? Or they have a higher metabolism? How would you describe them?
I love what Phil said about making the connections in the enterprise. Look, my view, and I'm a tech nerd inside out, but my view is tech is no longer the long pole in the tent. It's about people, it's about process, it's about data, and it's about technology. And if you don't have one of those four legs of the table in place, you're not going to be able to be successful. Look at what's happening around us, right? And both Phil and George talked about medicine. And, we know telemedicine's gone from 3% of US population to 98% overnight. But when you go beyond that, go to retail, think about all the trade promotions in the aisles that was happening. And now you're doing curbside pickup, or go into bedrooms being converted into classrooms, kitchens being converted into conference rooms, right? I mean, we have transformed significantly. I was talking with a fellow CIO, and he was worried about, ice cream sales actually falling off the cliff as we shuttered down movie halls across the countries. And so they were really thinking through how do they think about a direct-to-consumer channel. So you're not selling ice creams in movie halls, but people like me and my family are consuming the same movies in a home theater environment, sitting at home in front of the TV. And so how do you get that ice cream to me? And just think about that business challenge. That's digital transformation. You have to think through, how do I actually consume a movie? How do I make the selection? At what point in the selection process do I need to have the offering in place? How do I get the supply chain, the logistics in place so I get a 20-minute delivery to, an address outside of Seattle in a way that I can actually consume that? You have to rethink the entire business value proposition, from the materials to supply chain to delivery to logistics to how you actually get sales and engagement and follow through. And that isn't actually slapping a technology veneer. It isn't about putting a digital, sort of laminate on top of an existing process. You have to fundamentally redesign it. And that's, I think, the work that needs to happen, and that Phil and George and many of us in the industry are driving. And so to really answer your question, look, tech is super important. And by the way, on that note, I think the three building blocks, cloud, data, AI, they're the three fundamental building blocks that I think are coming through in a way that is reshaping technology backplines. The cloud is no longer about economics, and it's no longer about, hey, this is job number 19 for you, outsource it so it becomes someone else's job number 1. It's about innovation. You have to have a much more agile response. And to be able to do that, you need the innovation. And the innovation is the strongest on the back of hyperscalers. And so you actually want to lean into the cloud. Data is the largest driver of transformative value. We're actually restructuring end-to-end value chains, not based on what applications sit in there, but based on what decisions need to be made at different points of the value chain. What is the data that allows for that decision to make? And then how do you actually set a data fabric that gets you at the right data at the right point to make the right business decision and move forward? And then artificial intelligence, look, I think is the last one, is the third one. And I think it's a massive, look, the time has come for AI. And I think the value we're seeing from AI, both in terms of large AI, well, we all think about autonomous driving and these kind of big AI projects. But in the day-to-day world, I'll bet you in Phil's operation and George's operation, they're using AI for simple things: reading invoices, extracting numbers, converting languages, using computer vision to detect flaws and anomalies. These are small utilities. They're small bits of code that are coming in, and we're integrating that into our business processes. So cloud, data, AI, three big drivers. We're using that to transform it. But the reality is tech is no longer the long pole in the tent. It's all about getting the people, process, data, and technology, the four components working harmoniously to a common goal.
Well, since you mentioned the tech, I was asked George this. So if in 2017 you had to convince him to put snow tires on the car, at this point you're convincing him to put tank treads on the car. And so I'm curious whether those are the same technologies that matter to you, and if so, how you're using them. Are there other technologies? What's the equivalent of ruggedizing the enterprise even more for whatever comes in the next 4 to 5 year time frame?
I'm getting totally passionate. I'm Phil and Sanjay are just getting me jazzed up, right? And so the ask of me, Greg, from 2017 is, how do you cut and paste that, right? So if you look at 2025, cut and paste the fact that you were able to see the future back, right? You saw the future, you built back, you established it. We want that again. And it's, everything that Phil and Sanjay talked about is the essence of how to be successful, right? So Sanjay talked about the technologies, which are the right technologies, right? Cloud, data, AI, and the integration of those. It's not those standalone. It's the integration that's a secret sauce. And then Phil talked about, we are in such a fantastic position in all enterprises that we can see from beginning to start. I can talk to anyone in my company or you about clinical development. I can talk to you about basic research. I can talk to you about supply chain. I can talk to you about go-to-market, and I can talk to you about contract manufacturing. And in detail, and I'm dangerous enough to understand the technologies that will stitch them all. That is absolutely the secret sauce, right? Your technology's integrated with the business challenges and understanding the business. And when I talk to junior people coming in or mid-level career coming in and they say, I want to be a CIO, I tell them technology is not your major. Go back to the university. Business is the major. Technology is your minor. Understand that business and be dangerous enough to understand the technologies that Sanjay's hitting on. And when that comes together, it's a Reese's peanut butter cup.
No, absolutely. And Phil, building off that too, in addition to what technologies you're looking at and again, those three and others, Also, like just the skills to that point there. Like, what do CIOs? What do the new CIOs need to know, or how can they further educate themselves to step into the strategic role out of their traditional sort of supporting technology role?
Yeah, well, I would agree with what George just said around making sure that you understand the business. And I go back to this notion of CIOs have a vantage point that most don't. And, especially in large businesses like ours, multi-segment, multi-capability, those intersections become incredibly important. And so as a CIO, there are two things, or maybe three things I would say is one, an intimate understanding of how the businesses intersect, because at those intersections is oftentimes where you create the greatest value. And if not done well, it can also be where you create the greatest friction for the people that you serve. The second is how you think about developing talent. I think, our views on talent, our views on technology talent in particular, how you work, where you work, have fundamentally transformed over the course of the pandemic. And so I think as CIOs, you have to think about, your team and your talent. And then the third one I would say is you also have to think about development of your team. Especially in tech right now, we're in a war for talent. I've never seen the market like it is right now. And so this idea of how do you connect people to the purpose of their work? I mean, I think the pandemic has absolutely demonstrated for all of us the good and the bad of how we think about the impact of COVID on people and families, but also the good around how we've seen communities come together in support of it. And so how do you connect people to the purpose of the work that you do? And so I would say yes on the business skills, but also how do you build that team and talent? And then how do you develop your team and create cultures and commitment that people want to stay and continue working in the environment and the companies that we all lead?
Yeah. Well, a question, George, Sanjay, your thoughts on this too. Building off Sanjay's point earlier about the fact that like it's not about just adding a tech layer on top of it. It's it's total enterprise transformation. How do you build those skills elsewhere in the business? How do you get them to achieve? It's not just a question of CIOs adding strategy lessons. It's a question of the rest of the business learning about data literacy and understanding the digital layer. And I'm curious, like, how does those tie back into that? How do you transform the rest of the business to keep up with you? I don't know if either of you want to take that.
Yeah, no, so thanks, Greg. Look, I think we use the word trilingual or multilingual within the company, and I'll just take a second to explain what that means. And I think George and Phil have said this, right? Our fundamental belief is that, by the way, of course, the world needs more machine learning engineers, but but stay with me, the world doesn't really need more machine learning engineers. What the world needs is people that understand finance and machine learning, that understand manufacturing, supply chain, and computer vision, that understand commercial lending and pattern recognition, right? These are machine learning techniques, AI techniques. You have to understand, as Phil said, dangerously well, but then you have to understand the business context and the nuance of what we do. Look, the reality is tech is moving in an incredible place. And the way tech is presenting itself, I mean, I go back to the days when I was first going through my undergraduate education. We used to have these big machines, DECVAXs at the time, and you sort of got your hands at one. It was like it was awesome. I look at my kids now, and they're assembling their own PCs. They're taking a motherboard and they're putting their graphics processors, and one's got it just right for his sort of YouTube streaming experience. The other one's got it for his gaming experience. And that's what the world's coming to. You're getting the Lego blocks of technology. The software itself is becoming commodity. They're coming together in these small little Lego blocks that are now available. And the job at hand is to piece them together into a composable architecture, into a composite whole, into a capability and a business functionality. And what's important about that is the glue. It's how you take what and put it together. The value is in the context. It's in the nuance. It's understanding the business process, understanding the industry domain. And all of that is the glue. You'll pick the pieces of technology from a variety of different players, and sure, they're going to get better, they're going to get faster, they're going to get more innovative. But our secret sauce is that community is being able to integrate that together. And I think that's really important. And that's where the talent point becomes super important, because ultimately you need bilinguals, you need trilinguals, you need people that understand, Phil was saying this, the intersection of domains, because that's where the largest value is that can be unlocked. I woke up this morning, I was getting ready. I often listen to podcasts, as many of us do, and I was listening to Scott Kirby of United Airlines. And one of the things he said just struck me right off. He said, I think he must have been on yesterday. I heard it today, and he said, every day he spends 3 hours reading things that aren't related to his work. And of course, it's the moment of shame, because I looked at myself and I said, my God, like I'm not doing that, right? But what an inspiring thought. And it is about those connections. It is about getting outside of your box and thinking through where those intersections lie, and being able to optimize that. I'll just say one other thing. The reality is we've gotten a lot done, okay? But there's a massive job ahead. And I'll pick what Phil said about people and purpose and talent and how that's correlated. And I think about ESG and shareholders. And obviously, those have become big themes. It isn't just about customers. It's about your employees and it's about your shareholders. I think on the employee side, we're finding significant challenges around how do you manage a distributed 100,000 employee global workforce that is across the world in different countries, basically working from remote locations. They're not in an office, or the traditional HR techniques no longer apply. We have no mechanism to really kind of manage that in the way we were set up to. And so really thinking about how you reinvent the workplace. How do you think about the future of work? And that's all falling on the chief digital officer to be able to orchestrate.
That is a great point. That's a great point. And I would love to hear George and Phil on this too. In addition to not only are you building the technical infrastructures or rebuilding the technical infrastructures of these firms, you're also now setting the pace for how work is done, because remote work typically was over in the engineering functions, people who were used to asynchronous work. So George and then Phil, if you could talk a bit about both these things again, like how do you help the organization catch up to the speed of your units in there and help them come along with you on this journey?
Yeah, no. So I'm going to build on Sanjay's point in your question, Greg, because so let me take it to the past. So CIOs built large IT organizations, fiefdoms, right? Command and control, make technology decisions no one else can. And you had businesses that run businesses, and sort of they told IT what to do, was order taking, et cetera. They had their own silos. They didn't care about IT other than when they needed technology. What needs to happen, and actually is happening, is you need to federate your organizations out. You need to push them out, right? So a typical conversation that I've had very recently is, hey, head of accounting, I have a data scientist in my organization that's working on their MBA. Wouldn't it be great if they went to your organization, started understanding what's going on, start to think about where machine and AI could play a large role, natural language and phone calls coming in? Wouldn't that be fantastic? And so that hits two key points. One, it moves them, it federates them out into the business that hasn't thought about it before, and it places what I call a well-placed spy, right, in that organization that helps tie me closer. And that, for me, that's how I'm starting to push it out. You gain credibility, and you have really credible and competent people that are now driving, whether it's data science. Data governance is another big one, right? We need people that are data stewards, watching the quality of your data. That's going to make us better. And that's been my ploy in just getting the technology and the technologist rooted in our business enterprise organizations.
Phil, your thoughts as well.
Sure. I'll pile on to what George and Sanjay said, and then I'm also going to take us in a slightly different direction as well. It's been interesting. I mean, I think technology teams have been quite adept at sort of virtual working for quite some time in terms of the collaboration tools that we use, how we think about video, et cetera, et cetera. And I see that inculcating itself much more broadly across the organization. Some intentionally, some simply by example, and much out of necessity, as you've thought about teams have had to operate over the last year. But the piece I want to add to what we've just said as well is I also think that something that's become important along the way has been a much greater focus on how people experience technology. This notion of digital experience, this notion of how we design the tools and the interactions for not only our internal stakeholders. For us, we think a lot about, what happens when you have agents now working from home when they used to be in a physical location. How do we think about enabling our nurses and our clinicians to work differently when they're remote? How do we think about all of our physicians in our broad care delivery network? How do we think about how work flows to them, especially when you think about the level of physician burnout? And so we've been forced to think differently around the sort of the interface, the notion of how people interact with technology. And then when you start thinking about, United Health Group serves, 50 million Americans out of, UHC, and probably over 100 million Americans out of Optum. And when you start to think about what are the experiences that we build, and are those experiences really helping people guide and manage their care? And so in some ways, I think it's forced us to think about technology, yes, the complexity of what's behind the scenes, but it's also forcing us to think about the simplicity of the design and the interfaces that we put in front of our internal teams and our external teams. And I see the CIOs and the technologists in our organization playing a much larger role, guiding and driving those types of discussions and decisions as the way we work changes, like it has over the last 18 to 24 months.
Interesting. Well, we've talked a lot, obviously, about the pilot CIOs, but I want to talk, as we conclude here, about sort of those who are still engineers or co-pilots there. And so, two-part question, Sanjay, will ask you first. One of which is, obviously, the technology, in addition to the new tech coming in, old tech is phased out. I mean, the cloud, for example, started as private clouds by firms, and then Amazon Web Services and others built the huge public clouds that made it, I don't know, pointless was not the word, but certainly the economics changed. And now that's changing again. And obviously, this question of what technologies are core, what technologies are non-core are always changing. Pilots are obviously, focusing on the core stuff and pushing out the non-core to partners and others. So, how can engineers do that same thing? How can they get themselves into the pilot seat? How can those heavy hitters get out of coach, if I may mix George's metaphors there? So I want to go around with the three of you on this, on your advice to your peers who are still stuck in engineering about how they can get into the pilot seat as well. So Sanjay, if you could go first.
So look, Greg, my view is that one of the biggest challenges any corporation has is actually untangling the technology debt. I mean, the reality is these things are like spaghetti. You have so much technology componentry that has been accumulated over the years that sort of fits together in a way that you actually can't even properly document. And what I think a flight engineer can drive the maximum value is if she actually leans into that problem and thinks about how do you unwrangle that sort of mess, if you will. Because fundamentally, the go-forward plan is you need a flexible, agile, high-velocity backplane. You need a backplane on which you can innovate, that you're not kind of stuck in the mud around. And yet, you've got to run a business and you have to keep the lights on. And being able to understand that architecture of what you have today and drawing a roadmap to how do you get to a much cleaner place, a much more flexible, agile backplane. Traditional systems of records are shrinking. We call it the shrinking core. You have to approach that with that mindset. Around that, you need a fabric of data that allows you to use data as a transformative value driver. And then around that data layer, you need systems of engagement, systems of intelligence that bring the right insights and fill those gaps that you need as you transition into a different business model, into the next steps of your business. A flight engineer is knee-deep in that. They have their fingers dirty. They understand that inside out. It's not a small role. It's not something to be to not feel good about, because that's a massive amount and a responsibility that needs to get done. And so my advice to flight engineers is embrace it, endorse it, and then find a way to architect yourself out and onto the backplane you actually need to support the business around it.
Thank you, George. I'd love to hear your answer, particularly aimed at those who were once brought in as pilots and then found themselves kicked back into coach. How can they reassert themselves as, in fact, the pilots of this organization and sort of reassert their authority and take back control?
Yeah, no pilot gets to be a pilot until they log their flight hours, right? And so part of it is log your flight hours. Many people just feel they should be that, right? And so a pilot, really, again, you're a pilot years before you actually get to take the wheel, right? And so make sure you have the requisite experience as an individual. And then there's credibility and trust, right? It just doesn't happen, right? And you could be a nice guy, nice girl. You can come from MIT, Harvard, CMU, wherever. That doesn't make you a pilot, right? I mean, you've got to understand where you want to play, what industry. And if you're gonna play end to end, which is big, right? In the roles that we play, then you're gonna have to understand you move laterally. Sometimes you move down, sometimes you move, and then sometimes you move up. But you have to play in all these different spaces. So as Phil said, you can pull that thread through your enterprise, and to me, that's what gets you at the table. And it's that attitude of the technology that Sanjay mentioned, right? And the Reese's peanut butter cup of taking it to business solutions. So once you can naturally do that, an engineer becomes a pilot, or becomes both, right? Because once you're an engineer, right? But to me, that's a sort of the secret sauce to this thing, I believe.
Great. Phil, your thoughts?
It's interesting. I mean, I believe as you rise to this level in organizations, whether you come from a deep engineering background or maybe not a deep engineering background, I think it becomes important that you can use that engineering background if that's where you come from and help educate your peer executives. But I also think that as an engineering leader, an engineering pilot, you have to be careful that you don't become the person making all of the technical decisions. Because as much as I'd hate to say it, the further we are all further away from the details in the chairs that we sit in. And so I would say whether you're an engineer or non-engineer, there are two things that become important in that role. One is those peer relationships. How do you educate your other peer executives on the role that technology can play? As an engineer, you may be able to do that in greater level of detail. But I would also argue as CIOs, one of our biggest responsibilities is how we develop the team underneath us in order to have the greatest and broadest impact. And so I would say, even as that engineer, the way you continue to be that guide, that pilot in your organization is more rooted in how you are developing your team and you're stretching your team to have that broader impact.
Great. Well, I have time for one last question, and I don't want to get anyone in trouble with their respective employers, but I want to pose this question here, which is, isn't the inevitable outcome of the pilot metaphor is that CIOs become CEOs, or perhaps CEOs become CIOs? What's the ultimate evolution beyond this, as the CIO function continues to gain importance inside organizations? So Sanjay, I mean, will we see a wave of CIOs ascend to the CEO position, or perhaps will CEOs gain that sort of technical expertise? How do you sort of see those positions co-evolving?
Look, I think one of the things we haven't talked about is just digitization versus digital transformation. We use the words interchangeably. They're two very different things. Digitization is about taking an existing process, automating it, making it faster, making it more efficient, making it more effective. But fundamentally, the way it gets done is exactly the same. Digital transformation, on the other hand, is changing the way business operates. It's changing the work that gets done. It's fundamentally re-architecting that end-to-end process so work gets actually done very differently from the way it used to. Efficient, effective, scalable, high velocity, a lot of those. And to Phil's point, with the right digital experience, right? Those things become important. If you are taking on the journey of digital transformation, you've got to write a job spec for yourself that ultimately ends with you getting out of the job, because you're not actually driving digital, you're driving business transformation. Oh, by the way, it happens to be accomplished by digital. That's a side thing. You're driving business transformation. So yes, if you're thinking about digitization, you've got a great journey ahead as the CIO of the company. If you think about digital transformation, you are actually writing yourself out of a job. You're transitioning your roles back into the various constituents in the business, and then you are aspiring to be the next CEO of that business. That's absolutely true.
Great. All right. So George and Phil, how are you writing your job descriptions then? How do you see your roles changing going forward?
Totally rewritten it, and I now have it. I put it out on the street given Sanjay's description. So anyone can call me now. But no, all kidding aside, Greg, I see our roles a number of different ways depending on the industries we're in. We could be COOs, given what we know about the entire business and the enterprise. I'm seeing a lot of CIOs going into chief product managers, right? They're running products, they're running franchises for companies, or strategy officers. They're now driving strategy because, again, they fully understand the end-to-end game. So the run room it's just very, very broad for people that have our skills. And I think we have to take advantage. We're in the pole position, right? And let's maintain that lead.
Well, coming back to our flight metaphor, Phil, where are you flying the plane?
Well, the piece that I think is interesting in this conversation is maybe I might flip it, and I would say maybe it's the notion that business leaders, CEOs, operators all become more like CIOs, right? Because I believe that technology is the fuel for companies as we go forward. I think it has been for some time. I think post-pandemic that has become even more clear. And so I think that what you will see is a greater level of digital and technology acumen among business leaders more broadly. And I think CIOs play an important role there in terms of how they educate and bring their peers along. And so I would maybe say it's the reverse, and maybe it's CEOs becoming more like CIOs in terms of the depth and the level of understanding of what technology can do to drive their businesses. And that notion of digital transformation in its broadest definition and sense is what I think becomes important, because we see it here in healthcare. We see a continual growth of digitization of all of our experiences, how care is delivered. And what we see is our business leaders have to increase their acumen. And it's been exciting to see the partnership and the understanding that's occurring across our organization as a whole as everyone leans into tech. It makes it an incredibly exciting time to be a part of a technology organization.
Well, we'll have to leave the conversation here, but I look forward to reconvening in a few years or months or even weeks to see exactly how these roles have evolved, depending on what happens next. So thank you all again for joining. Thank you all again for watching. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I thank you all for your time and attention. And yeah, take care until we reconvene this discussion, however long that may take. Thank you all so much.